The Tower of London is often pictured as a postcard landmark, with its tall stone walls, royal history, and medieval grandeur. But behind those thick Norman stones lies a much darker legacy, one that didn't end with the sword or the axe. For some prisoners, death came not from guards or executioners, but from creatures that crawled through the walls at night. This is the true story of rat torture in the Tower of London, a form of punishment so grotesque it was whispered about for centuries, hidden between the lines of court records and ambassador letters, a torture that used hunger, fear, and nature's most disturbing creatures to break the minds and bodies of its victims. The Tower of London was built in the 11th century by William the Conqueror, not just as a fortress, but as a symbol, a monument of control. Over the next 500 years, it would serve as a royal residence, armory, treasury, and prison for those who dared cross the English crown. But not all prisoners were killed quickly. Some, especially political prisoners, religious dissenters, and suspected spies, were held in the deepest levels of the tower, areas few ever saw, and even fewer escaped from. One such dungeon was the Lower Wakefield Tower, part of the oldest, darkest complex in the fortress. Beneath the stone chamber was a cell so notorious, some called it the pit. It had no proper door. It was damp, completely black, and connected by a small passage to the River Thames. But that passage wasn't just for water drainage. It was a pathway for rats. Not ordinary house rats. These were Thames sewer rats, bloated, aggressive, and starved from feasting on filth. And when a prisoner was left inside the pitch-black chamber, the rats came. They smelled blood, sweat, skin. The prisoner would often be chained by the legs or wrists, not just to prevent escape, but to keep him still. Because the torment wasn't meant to be fast. It was meant to drag on for days. The torture worked in silence. First, the man would hear them, tiny scratching sounds in the walls. Then, soft squeaks. The water might ripple. Then the feeling of fur brushing against bare skin in the dark. The rats would circle, sniffing. They'd nibble at exposed fingers, toes, lips. At first, it was only painful. But as the rats grew hungrier, and the man more helpless, the attacks escalated. Eyewitness letters from the 16th century describe prisoners found with holes eaten through their limbs, faces shredded, ears and noses chewed off entirely. One guard, in a letter to his superior dated 1571, described what he found after checking the rat chamber. The man no longer screamed. He lay silent in filth, his legs red with holes, his jaw slack, and his eyes turned away as if to flee from within. Many died of infection within days. Others went mad long before their bodies failed. And for some, the rats didn't wait until death. They began their feast while the victim still breathed. But the tower didn't always rely on passive infestation. There was also a more direct version of rat torture, and it was more horrifying than the cell. This involved a metal container, shaped like a bowl or bucket, filled with live rats. The device was placed against the prisoner's stomach or chest, and the back of the bucket was heated, usually with fire or hot coals. In panic, the rats would dig into the only escape route they could find, through the prisoner as flesh, claws, teeth, and panic-driven force. No blade, no gun, no mercy. Just time, heat, and terror. This wasn't rumor. It is confirmed by diplomatic records, including a report by a French envoy to Queen Elizabeth's court, who described hearing of such tortures being applied in cases of silence. The meaning was clear. If a prisoner refused to confess, refused to name others, refused to admit to treason, he'd be handed to the rats. Why rats? Because they left no clean wound, no executioner to blame, no martyrdom, just slow, chaotic suffering, with the illusion that nature, not man, had done the killing. In Tudor England, political power was maintained not just through punishment, but through fear of the unknown. Everyone knew what the executioner's axe did, but no one wanted to imagine what happened in a room where no one screamed after the first night. One of the most disturbing stories tied to this practice involves a man named John Gerard, a Catholic priest captured in the 1590s. Though Gerard famously escaped the tower and lived to tell his tale, he wrote in his journals of fellow prisoners who were left below, where the rats knew not fear. He didn't name the cell, but he said this: "I would rather die once upon the rack than hear the noises that came from below in the black pit for 3 nights." Was this the rat chamber? We can't be certain, but based on the tower's layout, timelines, and known use of the Wakefield Tower, it fits. And if that's true, then John Gerard's surviving words give us the only first-hand account of a man who lived above the chamber and heard what happened inside. What makes rat torture so unforgettable isn't just the gore, it's the helplessness, the stripping away of dignity, choice, and even death itself. The victim doesn't die at once. He dies bite by bite, scratch by scratch, while the walls close in with teeth. And in the Tower of London, a fortress built on fear, the kind of execution wasn't a mistake. It was a message. But who ordered it? Was there some sadistic warden who devised the method? Or was this simply an extension of the state, a tool used when other forms of coercion failed? The truth is, rat torture was not formalized law. There was no official entry in Tudor codes that described it as an acceptable punishment. It didn't need to be, because the Tower, especially during the reigns of Henry VIII, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, was run by men given extreme autonomy. Men who were not only allowed to extract confessions, but expected to do so by any means necessary. The name that appears most often in connection with unsanctioned torture is Sir Richard Topcliffe, a notorious interrogator under Elizabeth I. Topcliffe prided himself on breaking Catholic priests and suspected traitors, and while he's more famous for the rack and manacles, several records point to his oversight of wet cells, likely referencing the low-lying damp rooms beneath the Wakefield Tower. One letter to Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, states, "Topcliffe has confined the recusant in the river room. He is chained and silent. If no confession arises, he may be left for the creatures to interrogate the creatures." That wasn't poetic language. That was literal. This method was designed to work not with physical violence, but with the threat of nature gone mad. To the prisoner, it seemed like hell had claws, and that their punishment was coming from something primal, uncontrollable, and endless, and even more terrifying. No one would stop it. Once you were in that chamber, no one opened the door unless you had something to say. And by then, your words were often broken to matter. And a grim irony, the Tower of London, a fortress that now hosts tourists and royal jewels, still contains remnants of those cells. Stone rooms, partially flooded, still accessible through iron-barred passages. Of course, they're no longer used for torture. But if you visit the right guide, and they're willing to speak beyond the brochures, they'll point to a locked corridor and say, "That's where the river rats came." Over time, the practice of rat torture faded, likely by the 1600s, as England's legal system shifted toward public executions and structured trials. But its legacy remained, whispered in prisons across Europe. In France, variations of this were reportedly used during the reign of Louis XIV, and even in the Bastille. In South America, centuries later, Spanish inquisitors were rumored to use similar tactics, sometimes with snakes, scorpions, or fire ants. But it was in Nazi Germany during World War II that the method would reemerge, refined into psychological terror. Gestapo officers revived the rat bucket torture, placing it on the chests of political prisoners, lighting the back, and watching as the animal panicked into flesh. It wasn't just punishment, it was performance. All of this, centuries apart, originated with the horror buried beneath the Tower of London, and that tells us something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. We often assume the worst punishments belong to the past, that we've evolved, grown more civilized. But the story of rat torture shows us that when power meets fear, cruelty finds new forms. And those forms rarely disappear. They evolve, hide, adapt, and return. The rats in the tower weren't just literal, they were symbolic. They represented everything society pretends it doesn't do, the tortures it outsources, the pain it denies, the truths it buries under stone walls and royal fanfare. And the people who suffered, they became shadows. No memorial, no tombstone, just a footnote in history, often unnamed, always forgotten. But in their silence, there is a story worth telling. One about how punishment becomes spectacle, how nature is weaponized against the very people it should nourish, how a fortress built to protect England's crown could become a den for slow, agonizing death, delivered not by blade or bullet, but by squeaks in the dark. Even now, centuries later, there are places in the tower that guides avoid, doors that remain locked, floors that smell faintly of mold and stone and old air. The rats are gone, but the fear never left. If you listen closely, they say, the walls still echo with a gnawing. And that's why this story matters, not because it's grotesque or shocking or gruesome, but because it's real, because it happened, because beneath the flags and tours and uniforms, the tower remembers. This is what happened when confession met silence, when punishment met hunger, when the justice system decided that even death was too kind. This is the true, historical account of the Tower of London's most horrifying torture. And this is torture's room, where every whisper in the dark once had teeth.